Thank you everyone for joining us. This is our fourth seminar of the series, if Izzy could nod for me if that's correct. And today our chair is Professor Dr. Carla Figueira de Morisson Faria from UCL. And yeah, she will lead us in starting this webinar.
Okay, thank you so much for your patience and for joining the seminar today. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. Please have a look before we start or during the seminar that we have a code of conduct for these webinars. So we would really appreciate if you do not record or take screen grabs. We are trying to run PowerPoints with captions, and if you would like to ask questions, please use the chat. This seminar series is dedicated to Professor Claudia Alexander. She was a leading scientist in planetary science and a role model to a lot of people. She was involved in major projects and she paved the way to a lot of NASA missions, including the Galileo mission. She was a remarkable woman, was the first or one of the first Black women to reach the very top of her discipline in physics. She was an author, she was a teacher, and she also was very active in promoting underrepresented groups in STEM. And it's a pleasure, she left us far too young, but she won't be forgotten. She left a huge legacy for all of us. And if you are interested in donating to an enterprise to help students from a disadvantaged background, particularly Black or BME students, to enter university or enterprise, please consider donating to generatinggenes.org.uk. And you'll be able to have a look at the link and make a donation. So to start our seminar, it's a pleasure to have today Dr. Ying Lia Li, known as Lia, for those who know her. She's a quantum physicist, and she has completed her master's at Imperial. Then she had a brief period in industry, and subsequently she went to UCL to do a PhD. In fact, that's where we met. She was working there on cold gases, optomechanics, and related things. She's an entrepreneur as well, so she started a spin-off company, and she has many awards, including the EPSRC. She got an EPSRC postdoctoral fellowship. She got several grants, and it's going to be a pleasure to have her speaking here today. And her talk is going to be on hierarchy, power, and money, overcoming barriers in fundamental experimental physics.
Okay, thank you so much, Carla, for the introduction. I hope everyone can hear me. Just let the chat box know if you can't. So hi, everyone. Today, I'll be talking about hierarchy, power, and money. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm Dr. Ying Lia Li, but everyone calls me Faria. I'm a researcher at UCL, currently funded by a Royal Academy of Engineering Fellowship. And in my spare time, I'm the CEO of a startup company called 0 Point Motion. Today, I'll be talking about overcoming barriers in fundamental experimental research. Really important disclaimer first, anything that I say reflects my own views. Please don't take screenshots. I've given permission for this recording to be uploaded to YouTube afterwards, so you'll be able to come back to it whenever you want. So I'm going to start with some physics about optomechanics, which is the research field I'm in right now. I'll go over my academic work and how I got into commercialization. Next will be the equality, diversity, and inclusion part, where I'll highlight the barriers in pursuing fundamental research, post-PhD especially, and the underrepresentation of certain groups in academia and startups. Although we are far from solving this diversity issue, especially in deep technology spaces, there are some things that can be done, and I'll highlight those too. And lastly, this is a real treat. I have 3 quantum testimonials. These are from colleagues and friends working in the quantum space, and they've recorded videos sharing their research and also their outlook as well. So really exciting. Right, so as I was saying, my area of research is known as optomechanics, and it's really the study of light coupled to mechanical motion. And you can use that light to read out this motion. For example, if you shine a laser beam onto a movable mirror, and then you compare the reflected light with your input light, you'll notice that the reflected light has this additional phase shift due to that motion of the mirror. And you can use energy momentum conservation to derive this. In my research, we go one step further and we make it into an optical cavity. So if I was using my previous example, this equates to placing a second mirror facing the first one. And this allows you to trap light, which is basically an optical resonance, and that resonantly enhances the optomechanical interaction from before. So now we have a coupling, but it exists between mechanical motion and an optical resonance, which is formed by the cavity because it's trapping the light and allowing the light intensity to build up. This is exactly the same as acoustic resonances, but just in optical form. So you can have linear cavities, which are called Fabry-Perot cavities, and that's literally 2 mirrors facing each other, bouncing light back and forth. Or you can have a ring of mirrors, or even bulk media, where the optical field propagates inside the kind of material itself. So only light of certain wavelengths can circulate within these cavities. For the Fabry-Perot one, resonances occur if the cavity length is equal to an integer number of wavelengths. So now, if one of the mirrors is moving, it changes that cavity length, which shifts that resonance condition. And it's like changing the length of a guitar string and hearing that tone shift. So if you previously sent in light that was on resonance, it now becomes off resonance, and that changes the intracavity intensity. And this gives you a direct readout of the mirror motion. So this is in kind of time space. And you can see that shifting of that resonance gives you that readout really sensitively of that mirror motion. The thing I love about this research field is there's so many different types of optical cavities and mechanical oscillators. And people make these structures in clean rooms a lot. So here we have a nanobeam, which is etched with holes to create a photonic crystal cavity. And also these donut-shaped things called toroids, which have these huge overhangs that flap up and down. And the strength of the optomechanical coupling is defined in units of gigahertz per nanometer. And that literally just equals how much the resonant frequency, and that's 1 over wavelength, remember, how much that shifts per nanometer of mechanical motion. And a gigahertz is a huge frequency shift. And that's why many cavity optomechanical devices can detect displacements at the attometer level, which is around 1,000 times smaller than the width of an electron. So these are like super, super sensitive. And it's that sensitivity which enabled the Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatory to detect gravitational waves for the very first time only a few years ago. So LIGO is basically 2 Fabry-Perot cavities arranged as an interferometer. And these gravitational waves are created from like crazy, wild, violent black hole interactions, such as 2 black holes merging together. And they give off these like shock waves, which literally distort space-time. And so as these gravitational waves pass Earth, it actually shrinks and stretches the space between the mirrors. And that's equivalent to one of the mirrors moving. And that changes the light intensity, and then we get this beautiful readout of the gravitational wave. In my PhD, I actually used spherical cavities, and these have optical resonances called whispering gallery modes. And this happens when light is confined by a total internal reflection inside the kind of spherical boundary. And because the optical field actually extends beyond the edge of the sphere, you can send light into the sphere using evanescent coupling. And that basically means placing the sphere at a distance d0 away from a very thin waveguide, which allows photons to actually tunnel across that air gap. And so if you now tune the wavelength of your laser and you look at the transmission on the other side of the waveguide, you will see a dip in the transmission, and this indicates that light has entered into the whispering gallery mode. And it's basically like the inverse shape of a normal resonance shape that you would expect. And that's how we can detect motion. So as the sphere moves away or towards the waveguide, it changes that coupling distance and it causes the resonance to shift, like we saw with LIGO, and it also broadens, which is an extra thing that we can play with. I create my spheres by using a CO2 laser to melt the tips of optical fiber, and because of surface tension, it naturally creates these really nice smooth spheres. It's the same way that raindrops form. And it creates this kind of microsphere cantilever structure because the sphere is still attached to a stem. If you then clamp this cantilever, you can align it to the waveguide, and this kind of waterfall plot shows what happens when you align that coupling distance while scanning over the resonance. And you can clearly see the whispering gallery mode start to appear, it deepens, it broadens, and it shifts. And so this is our readout mechanism for really small motion. Because the microsphere is clamped, we have mechanical modes. The fundamental mode is this Planck mode, and we can actually detect this motion really clearly by just doing a Fourier transform of the transmission of our light. Doing it in frequency domain is kind of the equivalent of like searching for a really loud tone in a sea of noise. So you're looking for this kind of peak coming up from the noise floor. The reason why it's there is due to Brownian motion, and this is caused by kind of random collisions of air molecules with the cantilever structure. And when they hit at the right frequency, it obviously drives this resonance condition and creates this kind of vibrational motion. It's why solids are never, ever truly stationary. Everything around you is kind of gently vibrating. So nothing is truly like not moving at all. And this is all because of this kind of thermal Brownian motion. So one part of my PhD was asking what happens if you try and force it to no longer vibrate? Can you actually counteract this motion? And what's really cool is you can actually use light to do that, because light is made out of photons, and these photons can interact with matter in very awesome ways. The first is that light or photons can actually apply a pressure. It's called radiation pressure. It's literally momentum that's being imparted onto your object. And it's very tiny, but in the right circumstances, it's super powerful. So this solar sail called Icaros, this was pushed from Earth to Venus using only the radiation pressure from the sun. So if you're in a frictionless environment, that radiation pressure goes a long way. Light can also pull objects towards it. So here we have an optical tweezer, which is just a laser beam passing through a focusing lens. That lens squeezes all of that light intensity into a focal point. This creates a gradient force, and any polarizable object, which is pretty much everything, will be attracted to this focal point. And because you can have such a small spot size in that focus, you have really fine control over micron scale objects, such as these polystyrene balls used to play Tetris. And this is awesome. This is just lasers doing this and making these things move. So by modulating a force such as radiation pressure or the optical gradient force, you can actually try and tune that force to constantly counteract thermal motion. So whenever something goes up, you make the force push it back down and vice versa. And this is exactly what I tried to do in my experiment. I used an optical gradient force as well as piezo forces to remove the mechanical energy from this cantilever mode. And you can quantify that energy with a motional temperature. It kind of doesn't mean too much in terms of it's not like you touch it and it's really cold. It's more quantifying the energy. And if you do this enough, if you keep reducing the motion of these objects, you eventually reach a limit. It's set by Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, which states that you can never precisely measure both the position and the momentum of an object at the same time. There has to be some fundamental uncertainty involved. So you'll never stop this thing from moving, absolutely. But actually by this point, you now have a quantum object, and that gives you quantum limited sensing capabilities and some really interesting quantum behaviors, such as the ability to place the object in two locations at the same time. So unfortunately, in my PhD, I couldn't get to the ground state. And this is really because I have this sea of noise that was constantly limiting me. So if you look at this graph and you look at this nice big peak, the area underneath the peak represents the emotional energy content. So as I'm slowly decreasing the energy, the peak area goes down. And if you look at the orange curve, it basically looks like a flat line because it's hit background noise levels. And the background noise, which is all classical detector noise and electronics noise, is actually masking the rest of the peak underneath. It's like an iceberg. And unfortunately, if you can't see that information below the background noise, you can't do anything. You can't do any more cooling. And so that then defines your temperature limit. So not quite cold enough, but certainly a proof of principle and pretty cold, I think. But it's not kind of the end of the dream, because actually lots and lots of people have been trying to do this for quite some time, and they use very, very different structures. A decade ago, people got to the ground state by cooling the membrane motion of this kind of tiny drum. And this year, which is even more exciting, a team in Vienna cooled a levitated nanoparticle to the ground state. It's around 143 nanometers in size. It's a glass sphere. It's levitated with an optical tweezer inside a cavity. And unlike any clamp structures, which are still touching, the environment, with a levitated sphere, you can let go of it and it will fall down. And that means that you can do the double slit test. And this is really the hallmark of preparing a macroscopic quantum ground state. So what you do is you drop your quantum sphere through these two slits. And if it's truly a quantum object, it should have wave-like properties. So it should pass through the slits the same way a water wave would pass through the slits. And then you can build up an interference pattern, which basically proves it. If people manage to do this, and this is very close now because we have a quantum nanosphere, it would probably be a world record, if not perhaps even a record in the universe, because, as far as we know, there's nothing in the universe that naturally creates large quantum objects like this. So being able to show that 140 nanometer size glass sphere can pass through two slits at the same time, that's really a major change in how we understand quantum mechanics. And it's also deeply philosophical, because at the moment, no one really knows why big things can't be quantum. Obviously, you need to be able to shoot lasers at them without burning them and put things into vacuums, which are emptier than space. But fundamentally, right, if you could do that, should there be any limits? there's lots of theories that suggest there are some limits. For example, there's a gravitational collapse model that suggests if you have something heavy and you put it in two places at once, it distorts gravity. They should have a gravitational pull, and the two objects will eventually kind of pull themselves towards each other, and that will force the quantum wave function to collapse. I think, you know, the great thing about doing experiments is really quantum optomechanics and experiments in that area can actually help verify or even rule out some of these theories. I actually don't know how you would do it otherwise, right? But anyway, it was 2016 when I finished my PhD, and obviously I wasn't at the ground state, and it, you know, wasn't so obvious that people would be reaching the ground state regularly. And so after my PhD, I was really unsure about where my research was going to go. Obviously, my parents thought that I'd be done with all this physics stuff, and they pressured me to like kind of get on with my life. But if I'm really honest about it, I think I was always kind of chasing this quantum dream. I was just looking at this graph of all the research groups who were getting close or were going into the ground state, and I was like, why can't I do it as well? And I was thinking about what was preventing me from really getting to the ground state, and a lot of it was really expensive bulk pieces of equipment, and the realization of just how expensive these things are, and the fact that my then supervisor didn't have enough funding to really carry on my project, let alone have it be a quantum setup. You know, it was kind of really weird to be like, well, you know, what do I do? It just so happened, and I'm just really lucky that I did this, the final month of my PhD, I tested my experiment as an acceleration sensor by just shaking it up and down. And that's because I have a cantilever, and cantilevers are really predictable. They obey Hooke's law, which states that a test mass on a spring will deflect proportionally to any force applied to it, such as acceleration. And so here's the output data of the photodetector, which is looking at the change in intensity going through the waveguide as this microsphere cantilever moves up and down because I'm shaking the table, and that's distorting the Wisp-Gary mode coupling. And so we saw, even just by doing this really quickly, that we were detecting picometer to femtometer motions corresponding to sub-micro G sensitivity, which is basically enough sensitivity to detect gravity fluctuations on Earth. For example, when the moon passes by, it actually causes tiny bits of displacement to the Earth's crust and changes the gravity on Earth in a very, very small way. But if you have sub-micro G sensitivity, you can detect that. And also around this time, I noticed that there was a lot of money being spent on quantum technologies by multiple countries, and it was becoming like a government priority as well. I mean, you know, fast forward 5 years, and there's a few countries which are approaching £1 billion of spending now just on quantum tech. And I decided, you know, to explore whether or not quantum sensing could be commercialized. And once again, very lucky, I just so happened to be in time to use this idea for this kind of Dragon's Den type opportunity, which was run by Nature and the startup incubator Entrepreneur First. Even though I went in with the idea of a quantum acceleration sensor, through the training and doing the 6 weeks of pitch preparation, I realized that developing a quantum company is a really long, uncertain road, astronomically expensive to do as well. And I struggled with thinking about the responsibility of that. I take responsibility really seriously. And so I stood there, and instead I pitched a classical sensor. And it was really weird because I kind of felt like I was back on the outside looking into the quantum club. Anyway, when I was asked to write about my experience, I wrote about the need for caution and not to overhype quantum technologies. And I'm actually really proud that that little tiny article got cited in an ethics paper for all positive reasons as well. So it was a weird time, but it was certainly interesting. I came out of that experience with a little bit of a chip on my shoulder, because even classically, my experiment had never left the lab before. And I wanted to prove it to myself that this wasn't a silly idea. So I went out and I got an industry contract to build a portable prototype, which basically meant being a systems engineer for a whole year. And it was probably the hardest but most valuable year for me. I learned how to automate my experiments. I learned how to code FPGAs, design bespoke CNC mounts. You know, even powering everything with batteries was a huge learning experience. And this is a complete prototype, even with this kind of 80s style control panel. So we weren't allowed to actually use any touchscreen monitors. So they wanted it to be like this old kind of 80s style way of doing things. It was tested outdoors on a off-road truck, which was applying plus and minus 60 G shocks. It's kind of equivalent of like mini space launch type forces. And it survived and it worked, which was frankly a miracle considering I made it by myself for only 30K. That's a very, very small budget to do this kind of thing. I'm really proud of this project because it proved to everyone, including me, that I keep my word. When I stood and I pitched at the Nature event, I promised a prototype, and here it is. But sadly, behind the scenes, I was going through a really low point in my personal life. The day before the week-long outdoor test, my granddad, on my dad's side, passed away. And at this point, I was working 12-hour days with less than 6 months left on my contract. So I just remember crying to Joe, my partner, worried that I was going to let everyone down if I cancelled the field trial. But at the same time, I was so exhausted, I couldn't imagine going through field test preparations again. I really didn't want to postpone things. So I pulled myself together and I did the first 3 days of the field trial and then spent all night writing a user manual so the funder could do the remaining 2 days of testing by themselves. I spent those 2 days basically like just crying my eyes out at home. So my relationship with my family is complicated at the best of times, but that event really changed my outlook on my career and work-life balance. At this point, 2017, I'd been at UCL for 5 years. I only had one publication, so I wasn't going to get postdocs easily. Because my experiment was really niche and no one else was really working on whispering gallium mode things in the UK, I'd spent a lot of my time working by myself, which actually amplified my imposter syndrome quite a lot. I also didn't want to kind of like quit and turn my back on 5 years of work. So I think 2017 and 2018 just wasn't very fun for me. You know, when you feel like you need someone to come and give you a hug like every single day, that's pretty much how I felt about physics for most of those years. But it's okay because that led to 0 Point Motion, my company. So although UCL kindly filed a patent in 2017, my contract was ending in 2018. And my career in academia literally hinged on one fellowship application. That was it. That was everything I had to keep going. And all the hype around quantum funding, these millions of pounds being spent everywhere, even me being invited to sit on a panel about technology transfer, you know, being the so-called expert in prototyping, it did nothing when it came to my job security. No one came to save me. And I am really grateful that the Royal Academy of Engineering saw me as more than just a quantum physicist and offered me my current fellowship. Another kind gesture that really helped was Bristol University's Quantum Technology Enterprise Centre, QTech. They offered me a guest slot on their pitch days. They are an incubator that offers a year-long intensive fellowship in entrepreneurship, and they continue to help me even to this day. And through working with them and honing the company strategy, I then won some innovation funding last year, which then led to the incorporation of the company this year. And so for the past 2 years, I've been able to go from hand making my optics to clean room fabrication, and all my stuff is now chip scale. And this is something I only dreamed about before. It's only possible because of multi-process wafer services. These are heavily discounted ways of getting your chip designs fabricated with some restrictions on the fabrication steps. And I've been using Cornerstone, which is based in Southampton University. Shout out to Callum. And although I've taught myself how to do mask layout, design, and modeling of photonic structures, it's been really, really useful for me to kind of enter into a new area of research. I also set up probably the cheapest chip testing rig ever. I'm still using sticky tape, so it's really not optimized. And this is how you get light into the chips. So these microscope images show fiber, which you hover on top of Bragg ratings, and that can send light into and out of the chips. And last year, I got my first Whispering Gary modes from a chip, so that was super exciting. And this really gives me confidence that we can mass produce our sensors, and this potentially improves the sensitivity of the sensors in your phone by a factor of 10,000. And this has a profound effect for navigation. So currently the sensors in your phone, if you switch off all connectivity to GPS, they'll start to drift after a few seconds. It will tell you that you're meters away, even though you haven't moved at all. And this is why we don't have good indoor navigation apps or completely driverless cars. And this is, you know, nothing against GPS. I think GPS is absolutely amazing, but it's a really weak signal. It's the equivalent of looking at a 60-watt light bulb 20,000 kilometers away. So we can't always rely on that. So the great thing about the company strategy is we don't need to set up any new manufacturing. We adapt to existing supply chains, for example, how you get computer chips made these days. And our target market is huge enough to just give it a shot. If it's not me, then someone else will do this for sure. And so through this, I found a new sense of motivation and also excitement. And I keep learning new things, which is, you know, the thing I want to do most is just to keep learning. Okay, so on this commercialization path, I've seen or experienced barriers that are quite similar to the ones in academia. So in this kind of ED&I section, I want to look into this a bit more deeper. But just a quick note, I am a physicist and I am learning about social science aspects of higher education and power dynamics. I will cite sources, but I don't know all the answers and I'm not an expert at all. When I give this talk, I will end up using terms like white or black, Asian, minority, ethnic. This is just how data is collected, but you should know that, you know, these are all generalizations. So I really recommend Kimberly Crenshaw's work on intersectionality if you want some more nuance about that. And lastly, when I question statistics, I'm really looking at the methods and decision-making process behind it. I'm not criticizing any institutions or individual award winners. Okay, so with that said, a barrier that I have always felt is the financial one when you think about starting a quantum experiment or a quantum group. It's expensive. You need at least 50K just in bulk items and then 100K per year for a postdoc. Of course, there's money for this, and EPSRC is currently funding quantum technology projects. Their portfolio is around 143 million. But when you start looking at where this money is allocated, you start to see things like location starts to play a role. Of course, there are sub-awards within this. So for example, UCL's fund will then be split further to other groups and other universities. But accessing the mechanism to kind of buddy up with the PIs or even know how this has been decided isn't entirely clear to me. And this tiered structure for allocating money is also now used for PhD student funding and the National Quantum Technology Program hubs. So nowadays, if you want a PhD student in quantum tech, you can only find one through a Center for Doctoral Training program, which is like a cohort of potential PhDs, and then you all kind of try and bid for a PhD student. And the quantum CDTs are pretty South England heavy, to be honest. The hubs are allocated £20 million each, and they cover a variety of activities that includes open competitions for grants. But that, to me, isn't completely transparent, and I'm more than happy to be corrected, but I've struggled to find specific data on who has received that funding. And to me, there is always an issue of bias when academics themselves get to decide who wins funding. So this extra layer created by the hubs isn't entirely convincing to me. And this is because our current framework for allocating funding by the research councils themselves isn't equitable. We've yet to really fix it. For example, fellowships rarely get you equipment or students, and nowadays it doesn't guarantee you a lectureship position either. And if we look at EPSA, which primarily funds physics research, we see that the success rate for BAME PIs has gone down in 5 years. And even though there are more BAME researchers winning fellowships, their average award amount is far lower than their white counterparts. And remember, fellowships don't get you that permanent position. So it's great to see more fellowships being given to BAME candidates, but what does this really mean in terms of equity at the highest level? And Professor Tanvir Hussain has done a much deeper dive into the statistics on his Twitter, so please check that out. Winning funding and holding an academic position or a professorship go hand in hand, and you can see the inequality in representation by looking at the Advanced Higher Education Staff Statistics tables, which they publish every year. So if we look at ethnicity again, we see that out of 4,815 physics academics, only 20 are black. That's 0.4%. And in the graph is plotted the ethnicity breakdown for physics and engineering. And it's really interesting because the spread is quite different between the two subjects. Just a note that the orange bars indicate academics working at UK universities, but who don't have UK nationality. If we look at professors in science subjects, so a bit more broader now, we see that only 10.8% are BAME, despite the census identifying 13% of the UK population as BAME. If you compare this to non-UK nationals who are professors in science, we see that they have a better ratio, and I don't understand that completely, and who knows what will happen and what could change after Brexit. I don't have time to go over all the underrepresented groups, but as a quick summary, we see similar inequality in gender representation. And just a note that advanced HE don't collect data with gender diversity. It's still a binary way that they're collecting it. But once again, there's something around physics which just isn't helping these underrepresented groups. And I think through my learning, I believe it's deeply related to history and how history of science is taught at schools. There is a strong focus on the lone genius without really conveying who else was involved in research or the problematic nature of some of these so-called geniuses. We have a long history of racist and sexist Nobel Prize winners, and often we don't find out how awful their views were until much later in our own careers. You know, I didn't realize how racist William Shockley was until a few years ago, for example. But it's almost too late then, because the lone genius image is already imprinted and it's really toxic. It creates competition and it breeds scientific misconduct. And one extreme example is Jan Hendrik Schoen, who worked at Bell Labs, and he was literally called a demigod for his research in tiny organic material transistors. But he falsified a huge amount of his data. He ended up having 20 Nature and Science papers retracted and his PhD taken away. And even though I can't stand citation data, you can actually see this fall from grace through his yearly citations. Although I do wonder, like, who is citing him in like 2020? That's just wild. Anyway, so in my opinion, all these things, they can't be solved with just diversity of thought. you have to have diversity of people. And to provide a community for diverse people, we all need to recognize the harm that scientific research culture brings. And we can do that by engaging with organizations that advocate for underrepresented groups. They have the advice, network, and understanding to help. We can also read broadly about history, philosophy of science, but I think the most important thing is training ourselves to listen to the people who have experienced barriers firsthand. Lived experience is undeniable. So these headlines might cause knee-jerk reactions, but we need to delve deeper, look at the studies, surveys, and interviews behind these headlines and practice empathy. Simply being heard and believed is a huge barrier for many underrepresented scientists. There are now more resources than ever to learn about racial inequality in STEM. Shut Down STEM is one of them, and it caters to people at all levels of the anti-racism scale. And the resources on this website will do more for your understanding than my talk can ever do. So I really encourage you to check that out. And if we don't take steps to improve our research culture, we create further inequality. There are already amazing scientists who are constantly left out of history books and awards, like Gladys West, who pioneered the maths behind GPS. And we then allow funding to be allocated without clear transparency and potentially with conflict of interest. So the amazing Dr. Addie Adelane and 9 other women recently raised concerns about how UK RI panels were deciding COVID research funding allocation, with one panel member being involved in 3 of the winning bids. What's worse is that 0 awards were given to Black PIs, when we know that the Black and minority ethnic community disproportionately die from COVID. I really strongly encourage everyone to think on this, read the open letter, sign it, and join the conversation on the 10th of September. This now affects the quality of research, which will then impact society. And it's this kind of community action that really gives me hope. We now have organizations and individuals willing to put money behind big changes in funding, such as the Dame Professor Jocelyn Bell Award. She donated her £2 million Special Breakthrough Prize for scholarships, Stormzy donating money to fund Black British causes, a new resourcing racial justice fund set up this year, and even more exciting, a new type of crowd-funded university being set up. So with respect to commercialization, well, startup land has similar issues to academia, a lack of diverse venture capitalists who actually decide which companies get funded, and also a lack of diversity in the structure of startups. And there's still a bravado that people have about this. In a government survey of the top UK directors, many stated absolutely ridiculous reasons for not appointing women into top executive roles. And we've seen some slow progress. Now we are around 33% of executives are women, but this is still a long way to go to reach the government's target of 50%. And a lack of diversity has already created racist and sexist technologies, either based on the use of biased training data for artificial intelligence, which I'm constantly surprised why that's not picked up by developers before deployment, or through dodgy deals where nepotism gets you huge grants, even if you fail to deliver on past ones. I think even worse, there's this lack of accountability which has enabled actual criminals to infiltrate the scientific community through personal donations. So there's a lot to be cautious about in our new age of quantum technologies. It's already showing signs of toxic behavior, such as using racist language, grossly overhyping quantum capabilities, and now government gatekeeping and political agendas. I'm not going to pull up photos of boards of directors, but trust me, if you look at the top quantum companies, you'll notice just how lacking in diversity they are right at the top. But luckily, where there's money, there can be accountability, and the public should be curious about how their tax and pension money is being spent. So Innovate UK manages a lot of the business funding in the UK, and they are involved in the UK National Quantum Technologies Programme, which has a total budget of £1 billion. A huge proportion of that is taxpayer funds. And disappointingly, it took until this year for Innovate UK to finally decide to start collecting diversity data. They had an optional survey before, but not surprisingly, only a 16% completion rate. And I feel like that's just like burying your head under the sand. So I'm really hopeful that Innovate UK will now collect, analyze this diversity data in a transparent and active way. It's now enforced so that every application has to do this survey. And I just find that it's really sad because out of the 70,000 jobs created through Innovate UK funding to date, we won't ever know if that helped or hindered diversity because the data is just not there. Okay, so that's a whole bunch of data and information. If we go back to my journey and how I've managed to stay in this kind of technology research, the short answer is by finding community. Within UCL, I've learned so much from the UCL Women in Physics group. I was lucky to run this group between 2017 and 2019. During that time, I got to know the 1752 group, who campaigned for UCL to stop using NDAs in harassment cases. And they really opened my eyes to things happening behind the scenes at universities. Last year, I joined the UCL Race Equality Steering Group, encouraged by fellow Tiger, Dr. Mike Seeley. This group comprises of professional services, academics representing all the faculties, and has been immensely powerful because they talk openly and honestly. This group worked really closely with the UCL Eugenics Inquiry, investigating the problematic research conducted by Francis Galton and Carl Pearson. And this year it was announced that the Galton and Pearson buildings will be renamed alongside financial contributions to rectify the damage their eugenics research had on Black and minority ethnic communities. And this was really evidence to me that change can happen. And so I can't thank Mike enough for being a source of friendship and support and guiding me through these like internal politics of universities. Joining Tigers was also transformative for me too. It was really inspiring watching Professor Rachel Oliver present in Parliament, demanding transparency in research funding allocation, which then led to the UKRI releasing over 5 years worth of funding data. So many Tigers are working on analysing this data, and through this I've been working closely with Dr. Arimma Ochu and the soon-to-be Dr. Hope Pressure on racial justice, and I want to thank them for all the conversations that we've been having during lockdown. I've also found huge comfort in speaking with Izzy, who is part of the team organising the seminars, hi Izzy, about contracts, roots in academia and also startups. And thank you to all the Tigers. I'm sorry I can't name everyone, there's just so many of you, but that's actually the reason why it's so amazing that there's so many of us working together. There's a high chance that I won't stay in academia, and I wanted to end this part of the talk with some advice for others considering a commercialization path. So build a community as soon as possible. I've been so lucky to find QTech because their incubator is built on transparency and kind principles. They take zero equity, and that has created like-minded entrepreneurs. The Royal Academy of Engineering has been really supportive because of their connection to industry, and I couldn't have done a lot of things without their help as well. Usually the University Tech Transfer Office will handle your commercialization path. I strongly encourage caution with that because it's not a standardized model. Every company is unique, every university is unique, and most tech transfer offices think about patent licensing rather than building companies. This often means they don't think long-term, and sometimes this is reflected in the high equity stake that they get. If you compare the amount of equity they take to successful companies, especially hardware ones, you'll realize how messy this can be in the future. So for example, lots of deep tech hardware companies need at least £20 million of investment to eventually sell products. And you get this through multiple investment rounds, but each time you dilute your shares and your control as the founder. Eventually, your investors will want to exit, and they usually want a big company to come and buy you. But by now, your share is so low, you have virtually no choice when, how, or who your company is acquired by. And this happened to the founder of Oculus, which is a VR headset company. Facebook purchased Oculus, promised the founder that users would not be required to have a Facebook account to use the device. But as soon as the purchase went through, they basically turned around on that. There's a Reddit post by the founder apologizing for this and basically saying, like, whoops, who knew Facebook would break a promise? But I think even worse for that founder, earlier this week, Facebook announced that it was essentially scrubbing the Oculus name completely away, replacing it with Facebook Reality Labs. And startups take around a decade to get to acquisition. So as a founder, to see all your work just dissipate, you know, I just can't imagine how that feels like. I certainly don't want it to happen to me. What people don't tell you is how much cash you need yourself to do this, even if you plan to pitch for millions of investment. So at the start, cash flow is really tough. Innovate UK grants usually pay on arrears, so you have to spend the money yourself before you can expense it. And you always need lawyers, and this prevents things getting messy later and you have to pay for those lawyers. And there's costs associated with setting up the company, getting insurance and all of that stuff. And this is why many academics who have startup companies have recommended that I also go into consulting so I can keep topping up some revenue into the company. There's really nothing stopping you from setting up a limited company right now, today. Just go to Companies House and you pay £13, I think. You can pay a bit more to do it through a third party, and it's all done. And it helps focus your energy by declaring yourself as the director and the CEO. But one thing that I've noticed is that I'm constantly questioned about my ability to be a CEO. And it's something I struggle with even today, even though I'm yet to meet anyone who I think could be better, if that makes sense. Like, it's a really weird limbo of imposter syndrome in this area. And of course, you always need help, collaborations, and partnerships every step of the way. So I'm not ashamed to say it. I really, really need help. So any angels out there, both financially and metaphorically, please contact me. Okay, so that's it from me, but there's something that I wanted to end on, which is for you to hear from other people involved in quantum research and startups. So these are colleagues and friends who I've met along the way, who've been hugely inspirational to me. Okay, so first we have Dr. Nancy Agarwal, who worked with the LIGO collaboration, trying to further improve the sensitivity of gravitational wave detectors.
I am Nancy Agarwal, a postdoc fellow at Northwestern University in Chicago. I am making this video from my hometown of Delhi, where I have been for this entire pandemic. I spend most of my time thinking about making better precision measurements to answer fundamental questions in astrophysics. I started this hunt with LIGO, where I was thinking about lowering the quantum noise, especially building room temperature quantum resources like optomechanical squeezers. Now I'm working on building an axion experiment called Ariadne at Northwestern, as well as working on a high-frequency gravitational wave detector which uses levitated nanoparticles.
Nancy is absolutely awesome, and she kindly did a talk for the UCL Women in Physics group as well. So do check out her Twitter and her work. Next, we have Dr. Charles Brown II, who I met at a conference in Ventura, California a few years ago when he was working on optomechanics in superfluid helium. It was such an awesome experiment to hear about. Here we go.
Hi, I'm Dr. Charles Darrell Brown II, and I'm an experimental quantum physicist and postdoctoral researcher. In my research, I prepare atoms at temperatures around 1/1,000,000th of a degree above absolute zero, the lowest temperature allowed by the laws of physics, and then trap these ultra-cold atoms in a lattice made of light. This experimental platform allows our group to study many-body quantum physics and provides an avenue to study exotic states of matter. I've met many obstacles along my trajectory, and I found that the combination of personal agency and tenacity, community building, and mentorship have played critical roles in my success. I believe it's important for us to find or build communities around us that support and empower all aspects of our identity. And I think it's important to find mentors that respect and believe in you, especially if you are underrepresented in STEM. It's important to note that any given mentor is unlikely to be a one-size-fits-all mentor. So I've found mentors who can provide guidance and wisdom in different aspects of my personal and professional life. I fully believe that the university system is one of the most incredible accomplishments of our species, generally for its broad and deep generation of knowledge, for widespread scholarly work that moves our species towards forming more equitable societies, and for allowing physicists like myself the space to study the mysteries of the universe. In the coming years, I hope to find a professorship at a research university with the hopes of making important contributions to science and, importantly, helping to shepherd the university system and its societal benefits into the future.
And Charles recently wrote a commentary for Physics Today, which I really recommend you check out. And lastly, Nick Farina is the co-founder of a quantum computing startup and also an advocate for ethics in quantum computing.
Hi, my name is Nick Farina. I'm the CEO of AeroQ Quantum Hardware. Our research is centered around building a universal quantum computer using electrons on superfluid helium. I'm also the founder of QC Ethics, or Quantum Computing Ethics. My great concern regarding ethics and inclusion in quantum computing is that we will make the same mistakes that we have made with many other new technologies. We don't have to. The opportunity in front of us is when the industry, both academic and corporate, is so small, we still can implement best practices to make this field more inclusive and more accessible, but we have to start that conversation now. So my hope is that through all the efforts we're working on, we can begin to do that earnestly and seriously.
I'm sorry, I think the subtitles weren't really working for the in-video things, so sorry about that. But I'm going to awkwardly end now because I never know how to end these types of talks. I just want to say thank you to everyone for making Tigers fantastic and for inviting me to do this talk today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Leah, for this amazing talk. And we have already quite a few questions. The first one is from Catherine Boast. What does it mean to get an industry contract?
Oh, okay, yeah. So you can just go to industry and ask to work with them. And a lot of industries have mechanisms to do this. Sometimes they actually have external competitions and you basically bid into them. But you can also approach a company directly and say, can we create a statement of work? So it's a little bit like a personalized bidding competition. And that means that you can tailor it to what the company wants and what research you want to do. However, it often means that you have to give away a bit more than you would have to give away if you had just gone for a normal bidding process. So for example, that prototype I showed you, that doesn't belong to me. That's in the basement of that company and I will never see it ever again. So, you know, that's the downside of going into a personalized contract like that.
Thank you so much. Now, another question by Clara Nellis. Do you have advice for someone who is thinking they would like to do the same thing with regard to funding?
Oh, what type of funding?
Can you specify?
So since this question's from me, I can pop in with the microphone. No, I was just thinking in general, I mean, your talk was so inspiring, but if somebody's watching this talk and thinking, I'd like to do the same thing, how could they maybe follow in your footsteps in that sense?
I mean, I keep a list of like where money is and I have a list of like all the fellowships that I've heard about, but I would say 50% of those were because other people told me about them. You know, as a researcher, you barely have enough time to scour the internet looking for when funding proposals are open and when competitions are and stuff. And so I rely a lot on just like the community and someone being like, oh, have you seen this? Or do you want to maybe bid together? And this actually, becomes easier as soon as you meet people not directly in your field. So I talk to a lot of engineers now, and I get told about a lot of engineering related money that I would never ever hear about if I just stayed in the physics department all this time. So keeping an eye on the opportunities is one thing, and then get people to proofread your applications. So it wasn't until I would say 2 or 3 years ago that I kind of started letting more than 2 people read my stuff. I have imposter syndrome, and for some reason I'm just really worried about showing people my writing, because, you know, in case they think it's really bad. But you just have to get over that, because there's lots of people that want to help. And actually a few tigers, Candice and Rachel, thank you, they proofread my Royal Academy of Engineering fellowship. And it really helped because they're not in my research field. So they saw the application with a different set of, assumptions, and they could give me honest feedback. For my Royal Academy of Engineering fellowship, it got proofread by 7 different people. And it's hard to do that because you get 7 critiques, but it really transformed my writing. So yeah, do that as well.
Okay, another question we have from Anson McKay is, he says, I'm so impressed with Lia's complete hands-on nature of doing the science here. Is this the norm of the discipline?
No. A lot of so I've always felt like there's this phrase which is like, jack of all trades, master of none. And that is how I felt my whole life, like even before I was a scientist, like even as a teenager and stuff. And I think some of that was because of just, you know, the experiences I had in my life, but a lot of that kind of tenacity, I guess, in my research is based on not having things. My PhD was not directly funded, so there was no equipment money for my PhD. So I really had to beg, borrow, and steal every single thing. And that kind of built inside me this kind of ability to stay lean, stay cheap. And it's not out of choice. I would love it if someone gave me like £1 million grant. But I think it's something which just naturally happened because of the way that my PhD went. And I now take advantage of it. Instead of feeling bad that I just have these random soft skills and little engineering things that I do, and I don't have, you know, that quantum ground state, I just try to twist it around and see it as an advantage that I have. So yeah, this kind of outlook as well.
There is a question also from Clara N. What got you interested in optomechanics originally?
Okay, so when I first decided that I liked physics, this is when I was like a teenager, I was really into particle physics, like the LHC and all that kind of stuff. But then I realized that those experiments are like huge, and it's like, you know, masses, you know, loads of people working together, huge experiments physically. And I realized that I actually prefer like tabletop experiments. I'm really good at my hands, they're tiny and they're very stable. So I really like really delicate, really nano-sized things. And I discovered this in my master's project at Imperial because I built diode pump solid state lasers from scratch. And that was like so empowering. Like you can make a laser. Like that was just like, woof. Like I thought of lasers as like these like super sci-fi things, but actually making one was really, really awesome. And from then on, I decided that lasers was like my thing. I will forever use lasers for the entirety of my career, my life. And it was really kind of, you know, deciding, well, how do I want to use the lasers? I can build them, but I want to use them to do something else. And that's where laser cooling comes in. It's used in atomic physics to create cold atoms. And finding out about this project at UCL, which was laser cooling, but on much bigger objects, was really interesting. And having worked in industry, I was ready for a risk. I didn't mind doing a risky PhD because I'd already experienced working in industry, and the pace there wasn't quite as kind of, you know, dynamic as it is if you do a PhD.
Okay, another question that we have here is, do you know any women CEOs, any other ones, or are they as common as unicorns? In your experience, how diverse is the tech industry sector?
Yeah, they're not that, I mean, I've met some, but I do wonder whether it's because I'm seeking out women CEOs, does that make sense? I don't know if that's a true reflection on how often you would see them normally, or, you know, but for example, Dr. Ilana Wispy, she is the CEO of Oxford Quantum Circuits, and she's been a massive support for me because her company is much more mature. They're at the Series A kind of post-seed funding stage. So she knows all about setting up a laboratory, hiring people, you know, doing all the reporting and stuff. So there are some around. There's the CEO of New Quantum, and I've forgotten her name. Oh, I know she's Carmen, Dr. Carmen, and I forgot her surname, I'm really sorry. But she's also a CEO of a quantum company. And I met her naturally through doing like pitches. You go and you pitch at various places and you kind of meet people like that. I mean, it's still very dominated by men, but I've definitely met at least 2 or 3 this year. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. It still sounds very low.
Yeah, I mean, time will tell, I guess.
Yeah.
Now, Mike Solu has a question about lived experience. Lived experience is undeniable, but people love to deny it. Why? Why do you think is that?
Oh, Mike, that's a really hard question. Okay, so I think a lot of it, I mean, okay, so this is all personal opinion, but when I've encountered that reaction, I find that it is probably coming from fear and uncertainty, in terms of fear because that person doesn't understand or doesn't have the background knowledge to even be able to be on the same level as you talking about something like this. And that fear somehow manifests itself as them actively denying your experience. And I see this a little bit in kind of, if you ever had like a really tough peer review and you're like trying to convince the reviewer that the data says that this is a real result, and then the reviewer is adamant that it's not. And because maybe in the first review, they you know, assumed something that was incorrect, instead of saying, oh, I'm sorry, I assumed my assumption was incorrect, they double down. And I don't know whether that's something amplified within science or whether it's just a human trait to kind of not want to admit that you don't understand something, and that even worse, you may be wrong in your assumptions. But that's how I see it. And I try my very best to kind of have that, you know, in my mind when I'm talking to someone. And often if I do find that I'm facing that barrier where that person is really not going to believe me, it's much healthier to just back away and not kind of damage yourself in that interaction.
Okay, there is also a question from Sean Collins. Is there any indication that Innovate UK are planning to release and or analyze the ED&I data they have collected? It seems sometimes collecting is done without any follow-up.
Yeah, so I don't, if I'm honest, I don't know if they will do anything with the tiny amount of data that they've had so far. They've promised that from this year onwards, it's compulsory to submit diversity data. And, you know, obviously, you know, because they're starting from scratch, it's going to be a few years until we can really see any patterns or correlations and stuff. I think it's a good move. Like, I'm not trying to shame them at all. It's just disappointing, I think, because this is not new. People do collect data like this all the time. So it's not like we've just invented collecting data.
I have a few questions as well. You mentioned that you give your proposals to read, for a lot of people to read nowadays. and that your main obstacle is imposter syndrome. But don't you worry, for instance, that someone may betray you, that someone may get your ideas from the proposal, because this is a highly competitive field. Not everybody's honest. And I trust that meanwhile we have built a community, but sometimes with that or that person, you never know. So how do we approach that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely still learning that. I'm someone who, in the past, I think I've been very giving to people, and even in my personal life. So I'm acutely aware of kind of I have to raise my threshold for trusting someone fully. I think something that I've learned through starting the company is to really improve on that and to be confident in that. Because with company stuff, you'll find that people hover around you and they'll want to be like an advisor, they'll want to help you, but then your second meeting with them, they're like, so how much equity can I get from your company? And you're like, we just had a meeting, you've done barely anything and you're asking about equity already. And I think through that and how just in your face it was, it's also translated into me being more aware that this could happen in academia as well, especially when you're trying to collaborate. And as an early career researcher, collaborations are key. You're not going to be able to afford a group, especially experimental stuff. And I think for me, the one thing that I have is I've been very lucky to be able to go to lots of conferences. So in my PhD, I did travel a lot and go to conferences. And so you end up meeting a lot of people. And then from that, you can kind of establish who you want to work with and kind of keep in touch with people to see where their research is heading as well. I always, when I start collaborations, I'm very transparent. And at the beginning, I always say things like, how do you want us to manage this? How would you like the money to be spent? And as soon as someone who I'm collaborating with isn't as open, or they're not telling me all the information, that's usually a warning sign for me. And I think that's my technique, which is probably not the best technique, which is to kind of wear your heart on the sleeve a little bit. But in the background, my wall is definitely up. So I think that's how I play it.
Okay. And also you mentioned that you wrote an article for Nature about ethics and that you say people overhype things. And did you realize, I mean, people are citing the article, there has been overall a good reception, but did you realize that this has contributed to some cultural change?
Yeah, I mean, what was really interesting was, so I wrote that in 2016, and I think what Nature wanted was this was really fun, I learned a lot, and I think quantum technology is super awesome, but I just couldn't lie because I spent 6 weeks cold calling companies saying, do you want a quantum sensor? And nearly all of them said no. So I just couldn't convey that there was a direct commercial route, for quantum devices, not yet anyway. So a big part of me writing that was to kind of balance between, publicizing this little thing they did, but also kind of getting across what I had learned, which was really that overhype. Even if people they overhype something, that doesn't translate into actual revenue, doesn't translate into a customer buying 10 million cold atom sensors or anything like that. And yeah, so eventually I guess that article turned into a little bit of a semi-ethics related article. And I'm not an expert in that, so I'm just really glad that other people are working on it and that they saw my article and were like, yes, it's good that early career researchers are aware of this and are advocating for caution as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Are there any questions? Would anybody like to ask something? Let me see. They're on Google Docs. So far, none. But it's quite an interesting point, this ethics, and also the point you touched upon, the lone genius, which unfortunately this is a widespread misconception in science. that needs to be deconstructed. Do you have any suggestions for deconstructing this idea of lone genius?
Oh, yeah, I mean, I'm sure if everyone, you know, took a bit of time to look at the history of your research field, you know, who contributed, and it does take energy to kind of seek out the hidden people. But that's one thing we can all do, and you just keep name dropping that person into your talks and stuff. But obviously that's not enough, because I think there needs to be a balance in equity around that. It's not just enough to say, look how amazing these people are. You actually want those people to achieve status, either, you know, by being professor, or those people to be recognized equally in future awards and stuff. I don't know the answer to that necessarily, but I think it does come from humanizing everyone in research, professors, you know, key senior people, provosts, whatever. Everyone should be seen as a human with all your flaws included. And I think when that happens, it might reduce this kind of knee-jerk reaction that you want to kind of associate success to like one person, or to claim success either, because it's so competitive right now.
Yeah, but it's a feedback loop, because it's competitive, because it is too much based on recognition. And
Absolutely.
people think that to go to the top, they will have to play by these rules. So
yeah,
it's a vicious cycle, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So
I mean,
is there anything else you would like to tell the audience before we close the session?
not really. I actually wanted to end this by asking you a question, Carla.
Go ahead, go ahead.
Carla, she does quantum theory. And so a lot of my talk is on kind of experiments and how to keep doing experimental quantum physics. But I'm really curious, Carla, what you think about the journey to becoming a quantum theorist. And whether you see similar issues with either funding or opportunity.
A big difference are the resources. Because as an experimentalist, you are much more dependent on resources than as a theorist. As a theorist, okay, the grant didn't work, you can improvise. You're not going to achieve that goal as fast as you would like, with all the resources that you would like. But it didn't work, improvise, move on, try something else. But as an experimentalist, you are absolutely tied to your equipment. So I think this is a huge difference. And it is much more crucial for you to navigate these power structures. I mean, I'm not saying it's not crucial for us, it's important for everybody. But I say, if I don't get certain type of funding, what funding do I need? I need personnel, I need equipment, but maybe computers, I need access to a good library, maybe papers, and I mean, that's it. But you really need to invest thousands and thousands and thousands of pounds, and this makes a difference, because usually this is going to disadvantage underrepresented people who have difficulty to get the funding, because of the very way the structures are set up. So I think a big difference between an experimentalist and a theorist are the resources. It's difficult for everybody, but as a theorist, I mean, you said, okay, I also borrowed from here and borrowed from there. As a theorist, you can do that, but it is easier for you.
Do you think there's more pressure in publishing though? Is that conversely a different type of pressure?
Yes, we do have more pressure in publishing. We have to publish. So it's pretty much publish or perish. But I think it's like this everywhere. You have to do, I mean, also there's a lot, I think, of gatekeeping, but I think this is in general experimentalist or theorist, if you belong to an underrepresented group, that there will be gatekeeping. So sometimes you want to publish a paper and then you are treated more harshly because that person has some kind of prejudice against you, not necessarily your work. So all these things play a role, but I think a big issue is the equipment, because you can keep on working. Even if you have to struggle with these things, you can keep on fighting, you can keep on working without much material, many material resources, if you don't have them. So, yeah, it's interesting, but sorry, I mean, I know that it may sound a bit tough if I tell an experimentalist this, but it is unfortunately true. In an ideal world, we should have a system in which everybody has the opportunity, that is not overly competitive and is not that you have to fight for every single penny in your lab. So this is also, I think, an issue that people see money not as a means to an end, but an end by itself. I've heard many people talking about, I have to publish this paper to get my new grant. It should be the opposite. You should be able to get a new grant to publish your new paper, not the other way around. So it is absolutely sick, because the universities, they put pressure on people to get money, because obviously they need the money. The government tries to cut the money as much as they can from the universities. And then the scientists, they have to start to think like that a grant is then an end by itself and not a means to an end, as it should be. And this may lead to a culture of deceit, which I think is a big issue, because a lot of people then they start to write things in the grant they have already done, but nobody knows they have already done, or they overhype their area. But in many situations, you have no choice. And this is something that is absolutely sad and goes back to your article in Nature that you wrote. Yeah, don't know. But there is hope, because we're all here.
And it's the bank holiday weekend in the UK, so 3-day weekend. Hope you have a good thing planned for the weekend.
I mean, only this virtual conference is already something that brings you hope, because you need fewer material resources to organize this. And then it's much nicer in the sense that you are not so dependent on funding. You need a Zoom subscription, you need people who are interested in watching, you need a YouTube channel, and that's it. Yeah. You don't have to raise thousands and thousands of pounds and write proposals and invite people. So I actually don't know why people haven't done this before. You know, I think you need something horrible to happen so that people start to find new ways. I don't know. It's strange. Anyway, so take care. Thank you everybody for watching. Sorry for starting late. It was a bit messy here at home with the Wi-Fi and everything. And have all of you, I wish you a great evening. Thank you, Leah, once more for your talk. It was also great.
Thank you both. We'd just like to quickly show a poster for next week. So I think Clara is just going to load that up for us if she can. But in the meantime, I want to say thank you so much, Dr. Lia Li, for your talk. But yeah, let me also say thank you so much, Professor Carla, Figueira, de Morisson, Faria, for your for chairing the webinar today. Thank you. And yeah, so we have one more webinar series left in this season. So this will be 2 talks next week on planetary science, optical imaging. So we really hope that you will come and watch these 2 wonderful speakers, Divya M. Pasod, I'm really sorry, I definitely said that wrong, and Dr. Kwasi A. Kwakwa. So I'm really excited about these talks, and hopefully you will join us then. Thank you so much for the presentation today, and see you soon.